Okay, so in summary, I'm just very quickly going to bring you through the structure to answering this kind of best or the most or the least, that kind of very extreme comparative verb in the question. What is the structure to adopt? Okay, so number one, definitely there has to be an introduction. So what is the issue are we looking at? What is the aim of the government? So things like this have to go into your introduction. Now, of course, there is also the whole notion of what does best actually refers to. So it would be good if students can also unpack to your understanding what does best mean. How do you measure best? So one way to look at it is whether it can be effective to address the problem fully. Okay, so when I mention the word fully, I actually mean that could the problem come about due to more than one cause, right? So does it target the root cause or the root causes of the issue or the problem? Okay, and of course you can also ask yourself, maybe best can also be looked in terms of time frame. So a policy really could be the best in the short run, but it may not necessarily be so much effective or so effective in the longer term. Okay, so things like this, you don't need to make a stand in your intro, but you will need to be able to suggest what kind of criteria or measurement that you will use in order for you to help you understand what is best. Okay, so the first paragraph I mentioned before, this first policy has to be that in the question. So if the question asks for text, then text has to be the first policy that you mentioned in your first paragraph. Okay, so the first policy, how it works. Now I also note now that it would be best if you can incorporate diagrammatic analysis. Some of you actually explain texts without diagrams. Now if the question asks for text again, please do make sure that you need to have some form of diagrammatic analysis in the first paragraph. Okay, now then to come the third paragraph, which is about the limitation of the first policy. So when you are looking at the limitation number one, you already would know that because of the limitations, it will no longer be the best policy anyway, right? So you have to know that because of a policy do have some limitations, you cannot say that that policy is the best anymore. Okay, so that's why you need to nuance it a little bit further down the road. Okay, and then you need to ask yourself, secondly, can these limitations be overcome by another policy? So when you're writing these limitations, at the back of your mind, you will need to know, when I say that the demand is price inelastic, so is there any way I can reduce, or is there any way I can change the price elasticity of demand for this particular good itself? Okay, and number three is that can the limitations fully, or rather can the policies fully address the root cause of this issue? So it could be this, can it fully address, is one of the limitations that you may want to write down. Okay, so in the first two body paragraph, be sure that you need to make use of your case evidence to help you. So a good, like I said before, theoretical analysis will only get you so far. Contextualization is the key to get you to the highest level. Okay, now don't forget, when after you have completed the limitations, you need to be transiting to your another policy. So when you are transiting, to make sure that you remember the use of these modal verbs and the use of criteria, conditions, parameters to help you structure your argument in a more coherent manner. All right, and then it comes to your second policy. Again, it's the same thing, how it works. I just want to make a note to you that the selection of the second policy, your first point of reference have to come from the case evidence. Usually the case study would suggest something for you to use as an alternative. So far, A-levels have been quite kind. They have been giving you quite a few alternatives. But if really in a rare situation where you can't find any alternative in the case evidence, then that's where you need to make use of your own knowledge. Okay, but the first point of reference should always come from the case study. Okay. Then, of course, you also have to include the limitations of the second policy. Now, some of you forgot to write these limitations in your answer. So now I'm just reiterating, you will need to have limitations. So make sure you remember this. Okay? Now, then you conclude. Now, when you conclude, you need to address the question. Because the question asks for the word best, there is a need for comparison. So when you compare, there has to be some criteria lah, correct? So the criteria, one of it I already mentioned before, time frame, short run, long run. Okay, so when you are comparing across policies that yield more immediate and more certain outcomes, that would be your taxes and your subsidies, all right, more immediate and certain. Compared to policies that are more long-term, then you will have your public education. Okay, so this is one criteria that you can adopt. Secondly, I actually have not really mentioned this to you, but this is something that you can bear in mind, not that you have to use it all the time, but just having one more criteria can boost your vocabulary. Of course, you are free to come up with your other criteria, but I'm just giving you some suggestions, okay? So number 2 is also the type of countries that you can consider. So if the case study already have mentioned to you certain specific countries, then you can use these specific countries as your examples. Now, if the case study has no countries at all, then you come up with the types of countries that you can consider. So number 1, developed versus developing countries. So they differ in terms of the resources that the government have. So if developed countries tend to have more resources, tend to have a higher budget, of course, they can do a more expensive policy such as subsidies or even a public education. So the one that are more expensive. Compared to those that are developing countries, they may be less resourceful, they have less resources, so they may not be able to give out so much subsidies, for example. Okay, or the extent of public education is now smaller, for example. Okay, now then there is also another type of countries that you can think about is the size of the country. So there are big countries, there are also small countries. So of course, Singapore is considered a small country. So what is a good thing about small country? Enforcement, monitoring. So this is also one of the reasons why vaccination, wearing of mask, all these are more enforceable in Singapore because we are so small and we have only just a few millions of population. If you compare that to US, compare that to India, compare that to even Malaysia, there are so many states. How are you going to enforce that people wear masks when they go out? So the enforcement and the monitoring will come into the picture. So as a rule of thumb, the bigger the country, the harder it is to enforce legislation, to enforce rules and regulation. So as a result of this, you may want to think about whether it could be better if the government can rely more on market forces to help you. So penalties, fine, taxation, things that can rely on market correcting itself. Okay, rather than coming up with a law and then we can't enforce the law becomes ineffective. Okay, so this is just some of the suggestions that I have, all right? And then I just want to conclude with the last part over here. Now, whenever we are looking at the best, precisely because any policy will have its own set of limitations, that policy alone can never be the best. That's why you see in a lot of countries, to solve one problem, there is a multifaceted policies that you put in place. So that's why we call this a multi-pronged approach, right? So you can have short-term or short-run policies such as taxes, subsidies, legislation that are more immediate. And then you complement with longer-term policies such as public education that will change mindset to make the policy more enduring and to make the effect more lasting. Okay, so That's all I have for you as a summary. I will be emailing to you all these PDF, okay, so for you to also take reference and also just remember for your revision. Okay, and good luck. Take care.